welcome to Astranti's real-world industry analysis for the MCS case study exam. This video is going to take you through the most important bits of our industry pack to help you pass your exam. But first, who am I? My name's Matt and I'm a financial writer for Astranti, and it was actually my job to write this industry pack for you. So I'm the best person to talk through it with you now. So let's start at the very beginning with the history of the industry. Now you'll see that I've managed to go as far back as ancient Greece. And that's partly because I like to try and go as far back in time as I possibly can with these things, but it's also because the ancient Greeks used mechanisms to help them calculate figures and numbers. And this, essentially in principle, is what we use computers for. Like the abacus, we input data and then we get something back. So in abacus, you slide along the beads and that helps you work out the addition or whatever calculation it is you're trying to do. In a computer, we input data and it can process it and organise it for us in a way that is easier for us to understand. Of course, we also use computers for a lot of other things, but at the very core of computers, this process is happening. Anyway, we don't really need to know too much about how computers work, we just need to know about the industry in which they operate. This is known as the IT industry. Now, although computers have been around for a long time, and computers that we would consider actual computers and not just ancient Greek mechanisms for calculations have been around at least since the 70s, it wasn't really until the 1990s that data centers grew rapidly, and this created the kind of industry that we would recognise as IT. However, it didn't take long for companies to realise the potential that IT and data centers had for their businesses. Now, because of this, it didn't take long for the whole industry to be created, or for resellers to jump in as intermediaries between these huge manufacturing companies, the companies that were producing all of this new technology, and the consumers. And there are a number of reasons why these retailers or these intermediaries had such a booming business. It's partly because these businesses that were consuming all this new technology didn't actually know or fully understand how this new technology worked or what it could be used for. Therefore, these intermediaries, as well as providing the actual hardware, could actually advise them on what hardware they actually needed and what hardware they could use. It's also because these companies that were manufacturing the technology weren't actually geared towards distribution. They had spent so many resources and infrastructure just on research and development that it would kind of distract from their main function or their core competency to deviate into distribution. It was much easier and probably in the long run much cheaper to have other companies do this for them. Now, these intermediary companies are known collectively as the IT channel, and they're composed of things like VARs, distributors and resellers. Now, these things are all quite similar to one another, but there are a few differences. So VARs are value-added retailers. Now what this means is that they take a product and they will add value to it and then they'll sell it on. How they can add value? Well, that varies. Sometimes all they do is add a company's brand on there and sell it off. And because of that brand, that product is now worth more because there's a kind of brand recognition that comes along with it. In other cases, they'll take separate components and they'll make their own product from that and then sell it on. And that's what SparkSpace does. They take the different components from different manufacturers and they will make what they call bespoke servers. And these are servers that have been designed by them for their customers. Distributors are exactly what they sound like. They get the product and they simply just sell them on and they don't really change the product at all. And they're also known as resellers. So let's move on to security. In the early stages of the IT industry, security literally meant having guards be around the technology to make sure that no one could tamper with it damage it, or access the information that was on it. Since then, things have become a bit more complex. We now have PC viruses and things like cyber terrorism. And this is when people remotely access information or remotely damage computers and their operating systems. Now, the way to combat this is through software. So now hardware and software have become almost inseparable, and many companies now offer both. And we'll talk a bit more later about why that's important, but for now, all you need to know is that security is going to be a very important issue for any IT solutions company. Another key feature of the IT solutions industry is the developments that occur within it. Now, being a technology-led industry means that every time there's a new step forward in technology, a new technological advancement, the industry changes. One of the latest examples of this, and one that we'll talk about quite extensively later on, is the introduction of cloud systems or cloud data. And this has meant that a lot of companies have had to drastically change how their company works. But like I said, we will go into that in more detail later on. But what's key here is to really think about how this impacts the infrastructure of companies. They have to be able to quickly assess new projects, new risks, and new factors that didn't before affect their industry. They also have to be able to adapt very quickly. They have to change their infrastructure at a very rapid rate, and they have to do so properly. Otherwise, their businesses could fail. But before we get into all of this, let's just quickly look at some of the products and services that IT solution companies provide. On top of the basic resellers who just take hardware, don't change it, and sell it on, you've got two key types of hardware resellers. Now, these are original equipment manufacturers, or OEMs, and they are original design manufacturers, ODMs. Now, they sound really similar, and that's because they are really similar, but there's a key difference which is quite important. OEMs create new equipment by their own design. Now, that's an important feature, that it is by their own design. So, an end user or a consumer might approach this company and say, we need new IT hardware. An OEM would say okay, they would look at what that company does, and they would design software or hardware for that company to use. Now, ODMs also create new equipment, but they do so according to the specifications given by another company. So in this scenario, a company would approach an ODM and they would say, I need a hardware that can do this, this and this, and it must have these certain specifications. The ODM will then create that hardware according to those specifications laid out by the buying company. So the key difference here is that ODMs are given specific instructions of what that company needs from them, whereas OEMs are not given that so much. They're just told this is what the company does, and then they produce equipment for them for that purpose. Now, the difference is significant because in recent times there's been a development where ODMs are growing very rapidly, and it's because they're providing services for these huge corporations who are outsourcing production to them. So a company like Amazon, per se, would use ODMs to produce their own servers. They would tell them, we need servers that do this, this and this, and have these certain specifications, and then that ODM will build them for it. These contracts are huge because these kind of companies usually want a lot of servers, so it's always going to be a big project, and big projects mean big profits. This is a significant development for SparkSpace because they've recently moved into the HPC industry, and HPCs are high performance computers, and they're going to be big projects because they're going to be processing what we call big data, which is just huge sums of data. And it's not going to be likely that a company that needs this kind of big data won't have its own in-house expertise about what kind of systems they need and what specifications these systems will need. So SparkSpace may need to move into a bit more of an ODM model rather than an OEM model in future if they're to keep up or not lose business to these ODM companies. Another key change in the industry at the moment is involved with the services. Now this involves things like installation and maintenance. However, recently there's been a shift towards services in the industry. It's a lot more profitable than providing servers or the hardware. And this is because the hardware tends to be so similar, unless you need very specific requirements, it tends to be so similar that you can't really mark up on what you're selling because there's about 10 other companies providing exactly the same thing. However, with services, it's a lot easier to differentiate yourself from the competition. There's things such as what services you actually provide, what kind of deals you provide, and what kind of expertise or staff levels you provide. And this can make a big difference in the services industry. For example, if your company is running on a certain IT system that stops working and you call the company and they take 10 days to come out, you're not going to be able to operate your business for 10 days. Whereas if you go with a company and your operating system breaks down, you call them up and they're there within an hour and they fix it, no problem, then you've not really had too much of a delay on your business day, let alone having to stop for 10 days. So there's a lot more scope for companies to make profits within the services division of the industry. It's also been driven by new technologies such as cloud technology, which as I mentioned before, I'm going to talk a bit more in detail later on. But that's because cloud systems are more easily adapted to being provided as a service rather than a product. And this has implications for all the company's infrastructures, as instead of getting paid for doing big projects or providing hardware, which is a one-off payment, they're now having to take payments on a monthly basis for providing these kind of services. Okay, so let's move on to the products. Although we do have a breakdown of the hardware industry here, but all you really need to know that I've not already mentioned is that the industry is growing and that there is still an increase in demand for IT solutions. The rest of it I've all kind of really covered, or I will cover later on, so don't worry about that there. So let's have a quick look at the advantages and disadvantages of the products that companies like SparkSpace provide. So first, let's look at the generic hardware. Now this is stuff that companies get from the manufacturers and then they just sell on without making any real changes to the product itself. Now the good thing about these is that they're cheap and they're easy to make. And this is because there's no real brand loyalty within the industry for these components. People don't really care where each component has come from, they just care that it's cheap and it's easy to get. And this means that you as a reseller have a strong buyer power and they have a weak supplier power. So you have a lot more power to negotiate the price of the parts that you're buying or the hardware that you're buying. However, because of this, there's not much to differentiate you between your other competitors. So just as your suppliers had poor supplier power, you yourself have poor supplier power. And this means that there's very little markup potential, and it also means that there's a very saturated market because it doesn't really take much expertise or knowledge to get into this business. It's a very easy access industry. So if we move on to bespoke hardware, it's a completely different product. It has a higher markup potential because your product is going to be different from others. You've added a lot more value to it by making it specifically for the customer. And this provides you with a good point of difference, which differentiates you from your competitors. However, it is a lot more expensive. It takes a lot of capital to fund the research and development enterprises that will fuel and put forward your business. And as we said, the technology is always advancing, so you can't just come up with one product and then be happy with that and carry on selling it. You've got to be constantly researching and developing new products for your customers. And lastly, I've already talked about services, so I won't go into detail, but it does provide a good way of making a point of difference with your competitors again. However, it does require an extensive infrastructure. If you're going to provide good services quickly, you need to have staff that can move straight to where the company's servers are and perform any maintenance or repairs that need to be done. And you also need to have a point of contact. Customers need to be able to tell you that things have gone wrong or things are broken. They need to be able to organise appointments for people to come around and fix things. So there's a lot of infrastructure there. You may need to get new parts for certain pieces of hardware, and all of this is quite expensive to create and maintain.